Thank you very much, Rasha, for the invitation and for Mucem for organizing the event. It's an honor to be here with some of the participants, and to those of you who have come from Marseille, thank you for attending this lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the research behind some of my recent work, and I'm going to be focusing on two projects. I know in the program it says I'm focusing on the botanist, a work on a botanist, but I will also speak a little bit about the film, which hopefully some of you have seen earlier this morning. I don't know how many saw the film. Okay, good. That's helpful. Yeah. So before going into the projects, I just wanted to give a general statement on my practice. I'm a visual artist, and I work primarily with film, sculpture, and installation. The general theme that I work on is the way that power develops between different biographical, colonial, and other historical narratives. And I work on two main levels. One is a more discursive and narrative-based approach, and the other more metaphysical and abstract. The films borrow from different genres: theater, film essays, and fiction, and they're usually the result of long-term research processes. The sculptures, on the other hand, are usually more intuitive gestures, condensations and abstractions of some of the themes that are often explored in the films. Around 2011, I began researching the modern history of Jerusalem and the representation of Palestine in the Western biblical imaginary. This process entailed looking through various archives in Jerusalem. Salim Tamari and Muhannad Yaoubi spoke a little bit about this theme yesterday for those of you who were here. So some of the archives I looked at were that of the Library of Congress, who have a large photographic collection of the Eric and Mattson photographers from the American colony. I also spent some time in the Israeli National Archives, who have a lot of material that was stolen and preserved from Palestinians before 1948. And others, German Protestant Archive and other smaller ones that are in Jerusalem. I was also reading a lot of books by chroniclers who lived in the city, historians, and other researchers. I would often find myself in a state of awe as I looked through these images and listened to the sounds from the city that I grew up in. It was as if I was suddenly walking through time, with specters of these lives past, speaking to me and helping me imagine what it would have been like to live in Jerusalem 60, 80, or 120 years ago. Aside from the memoirs of Palestinians and a small group of local photographers in the city, much of the visual material of modern Palestine was produced by European and American scholars and travelers that arrived to the country. These geographers, botanists, archaeologists, ethnographers rushed to explore the threads of connection between present-day Palestine and the past, specifically the biblical past. In their investigation and categorization of the land and its people, these missions would come to establish a colonial apparatus in Palestine through civic and also military institutions, first through the British and later, of course, through the Zionist project. Many Palestinian scholars, including Issam Nassar and others, have commented on this artificial freezing of time in both written and photographic depictions of Western travelers and scholars. This lens would ignore the complexity of Palestinian society and rather write Palestine and its people out of history. Palestinians, like the East at large, would be reduced into a fixed, stable thing that belongs to the past, that has not entered, and according to some, should not enter modern times. What drew me to these documents was their paradoxical nature, being on the one hand documents of preservation, records of cultural forms that are perhaps no longer apparent today, but also simultaneously the roots of the erasure of Palestine. My projects have tried to rework these materials, to decolonize them by appropriation, and utilize them as one fragment amongst many in a cacophonous field of narrative and representation. So I'm going to begin by talking about the film from this morning, A Magical Substance Flows Into Me, and then I will go on to speak about The Botanist. And I'm not going to be covering all of the themes of the films, but I just chose to highlight a few of the issues that were important for me in the process of making the film and the period of research behind it. So this film is based on a radio program made by a German Jewish ethnomusicologist by the name of Robert Lachman. Robert Lachman was born around 1900 and he died in 1940. He used to be the head of the music archives in the Berlin National Library, and he lost his job with the Nazis' rise to power in 1935. It's after this that Judah Magnus, the chancellor of the Hebrew University at the time, invited him to Jerusalem to continue his research, as he could no longer have a public job in Germany. And he invited him to establish a department of Oriental music at the Hebrew University and a phonographic archive of recordings from Palestine at that time. For various reasons, he didn't receive the funding that he was hoping to get to establish this department. Most of the funders of the Hebrew University at that time were looking to fund projects that were helping legitimize a Jewish presence in Palestine, and studying Oriental music didn't really fit into this program. So Lachman was making jobs for himself, and one of the things he did was propose a radio program to the Palestine Broadcasting Service. This program is called Oriental Music, and what he would do is once a week he would give a lecture on the radio about one of the different Oriental groups to be found in Palestine, and then he would invite what to his ears was the best representatives of this musical tradition. So he featured groups such as Kurdish, Moroccan, and Yemenite Jews, Samaritans, members of the urban and rural Palestinian community, Bedouins, and Coptic Christians. And in the film, I bring these recordings to the groups as they are living today and in around Jerusalem, the West Bank, and also Israel. And I sound the recordings off of my iPhone, and I invite the musicians to respond to these recordings as they would in the tradition today. The film was shot primarily in Jerusalem, but also in Sechnin and the Galilee, in Nablus, Rosh Ha'ain, which is next to Tel Aviv, the Naqab, where the majority of the Palestinian Bedouins live today. So the main theme of the film is music, but the music is also an excuse to talk through many other issues. The Palestinians and the Arab Jews under Zionism, intergenerational relationships, the notion of authenticity in music, everyday life, and desire. But most of all, for me, it was a film about sensual and visceral memory. And the potential of listening to music and listening to sounds from the past. So it's kind of an exploration of memory, but as told through music and the senses. It was first shown as an installation in Chisenhale Gallery in 2015, together with a body of sculptures made from plaster and other found materials. And there was this platform that was built both as a podium for the sculpture, but also seating for the audience. I'm not going to go in too much into the sculptures here, but if you're curious to know, I'd be happy to talk about it later in the discussion. And it later premiered as a film in the Berlinale. So I wanted to talk about how I found this character of Robert Lachman. And that's through a figure who many of you heard of already yesterday in Salim's presentation. And that's Wasif Jauhari. So I was also reading his memoirs in around 2011-12, and I was, of course, very enchanted by his descriptions of the city. And this was a source of inspiration for a number of projects that I did from then. And there's one chapter in the book where Wasif talks about his encounter with a certain Dr. Robert Lachman. And their relationship kind of continued over several months and maybe years, where Lachman would come to visit Wasif at home and record him playing music. He would also invite Wasif to come with him when he would lecture at universities. Lachman was teaching both in kind of Arab and Hebrew institutions in the city at the time, and Wasif was his kind of native illustrator. So Lachman would lecture, and Wasif would kind of perform small musical intervals to better illustrate the theories of Lachman. So their relationship interested me, but specifically one conversation they had about the future of Arabic music, and if Oriental music should use Western system of notation or not. And Lachman, who was the European, was against Arabic music adopting a Western system of notation because he felt that it has a completely different logic to it. There's the quarter note system, and it has a different history, and it should rather develop its own system of notation. So he wanted it to remain pure and free from any kind of Western influence. Jauhariya, on the other hand, was very much open to the idea of using notation as a tool for progress. He thought that it could be a way of preserving vanishing oral traditions. So this debate for me kind of became a motor behind this project, thinking about some of the dilemmas of modernity in Palestine at the time, kind of what we use as a model of progress from the West, what we consider kind of holding on to tradition, and this kind of bifurcated relationship with Europe and the West at large. So when I first went to the archive of Robert Lachman, I was actually looking for the recordings of Wasif Jauhariya, because Wasif mentions that there's 17 discs that Lachman recorded with him in his home in Jerusalem. Surprisingly or not, there was no record of Wasif in the Lachman archives, which are now at the Music and Sound archives of the National Library of Israel. And this kind of disappearance fits many colonial historiographies where there was a dependence on native informants who were later written out of those histories. Despite this initial disappointment, I found there to be a magnetic quality to the archive. Wasif's records weren't there, but there was thousands of other documents that I kept coming back, wanting to leaf through Lachman's notes and listen to the music he had recorded. It was really this impulse to listen and to come closer to these sounds and images that inspired me to make the film. So as I spent time in his archive, it's when I learned about the Oriental music broadcasts that I decided from that point would be the subject of my film, rather than Wasif. Given the Orientalist nature of Lachman's methodology as an ethnographic recorder, my first challenge was how to rework the material without repeating the same patterns of representation. What would it mean if I, a native Palestinian, performed the role of Lachman, a Jewish refugee and European ethnographer? Who would my gaze be observing, and what kind of power relations would be at play? And I came to realize that it would actually be an empowering exercise to do an ethnography of Israeli society, since historically and also today, it's the Israelis who study the Palestinians, either as a solidarity gesture, but also in terms of various ethnographic studies. So that was kind of one of the first motives of the film. And secondly, I decided that rather than repeating Lachman's divide of an ethnographer and his subject, I wanted to let the musicians tell their own histories, so they would speak for themselves. And I would also include a portrait of myself and my parents in our family home. So it's with these thoughts that I started looking for the best representatives of these traditions today. And I contacted friends and musicologists, and I spent time online. And I was at this time living at my parents' house, and every day or every other day traveling to another part of the country to meet some of these musicians. And this research process is really what became the script of the film that I later restaged. Another decision I took in the kind of reenactment of Lachman's radio program was not to invite all of the musicians to one location, kind of symbolizing the old radio that's of course disappeared, but rather to visit each of the musicians in their separate homes to emphasize the state of segregation that they're all found in today. So in this sense, A Magical Substance is an altered reenactment and relocation of Lachman's radio program, where the camera is making the field recordings rather than the wax discs of the 1930s. Lachman's initial, but maybe well-intentioned search for cultural authenticity and purity in Oriental music, advocating for it to remain untouched by Western influences, is what actually produced an alien document of culture in its methods of classification and mediation. in this scene, we see Palestinians performing wedding music, and they're using, Hussein Abu Ali is using a synthesizer here, a keyboard, which I think would make Lachman kind of turn in his grave if he saw. And for me, the present day musicians kind of are proof that the culture was not destroyed by the changes of modernity, and that in fact, hybridity and provisionality are the only true forms of culture. So, as many of you noticed, the main topic that I was dealing with in the film is the question of the Arab Jews or the Oriental Jews. In Israel, they're called the Mizrahis, which is a kind of umbrella term for all of the Jews that immigrated from the Arab and Islamic world. When I first saw Lachman's archive of the Oriental music broadcasts, I found it very compelling because I had never before seen a project that looks at the Palestinians and the Eastern Jews through a single lens. I'm certain that this now exists, but at the time it was kind of a discovery for me, a refreshing perspective. And this is even though more than 50% of Israel's Jewish population is of Arab descent. When Lachman was working, these Jewish communities still lived and were an integral part of the Arab world. And on an epistemological level, I found there to be a great potential in revisiting this juxtaposition. After all, the same historical process that dispossessed the Palestinians was intimately linked to the process that dispossessed the Arab Jews of their rootedness in Arab countries. But while one group created a new homeland, and that is Israel, the Palestinians remained in a permanent state of exile. This is Neta Al-Kayam, who is, she's an Israeli singer of Moroccan heritage, and her partner, Amit Cohen, in their kitchen in Jerusalem. I was hoping through the film to critique the founding premises of Orientalist representation and Eurocentric discourse that has turned the Arab and the Jew into distinct and opposite categories. This framework, first of all, implies that the Oriental Jews in Israel confront their Arab descent, as we saw in Avi's film also yesterday. And also which Neta is doing. She's very vocal about her relationship to Morocco and how her grandmother was the one who gave her access to this culture that her parents, already the second generation immigrants, were trying to kind of ignore. But it was also a kind of an exercise in thinking about what the depletion of the Jews from the Arab world has had on our region, both culturally and ideologically. I wanted to read you a quote by an article, from an article by a political scientist, Layla Farsakh, which for me articulates some of the core issues of this film. She's exploring the ways in which Palestinians and Zionist nationalisms have responded to the question or to the possibility of a one-state solution or a binational federation in Palestine and Israel. In this alternative to partition, Israelis would have to confront the fact that they live in an Arab world, that over 50% of its Jewish population are of Arab descent. But Zionism cannot deal with such a reality, since it is based on the premise that it is a Western civilizing enterprise seeking to universalize the Jew, including the Arab Jew, and turn him into an enlightened, that is, Ashkenazi Jew, who has his home like all civilized nations. The level of negation of the Arab Jew, as already noted by Ella Shohat, amongst others, is still profound in Israeli society and still frowned upon and is considered derogatory. Yet it is a term that is central to this new state. The Arab Jew is as much part of the Jewish identity as it is part of the Arab world, both negated and yet in need of rehabilitation in today's historical context. The Arab Jew is a category that is both romanticized and under-researched, but which can become a vehicle for reconciliation and unlock the conflict. So what I was interested in was more thinking about this potentiality of the role of the Arab Jew, seen alongside the Palestinian struggle. And for me, it's more of a lost alliance between these two groups rather than a really viable way forward today. Because today there's a ontological polarity between the Mizrahis and the Palestinians. So if this alliance is to be revived, it can only be done after a process of historical reconciliation. So the main theme, and that's music, was of course something I thought a lot about, and its potential. And I was thinking a lot about kind of sounds that I was hearing growing up in Shafat. This is in East Jerusalem, where my parents' home still is. And it's not uncommon that there would be kind of young men driving a loud car at night with their kind of windows rolled down and blasting music. And sometimes this would be kind of Arabic, Egyptian, Syrian pop, but sometimes it's also Mizrahi, so Hebrew pop. And this kind of always intrigued me, that how could these Palestinians so shamelessly be kind of blasting Mizrahi music in the neighborhood, but also we see this in the West Bank and in other places, but it's quite common in Jerusalem. So it seemed, and kind of when you would ask them, they would probably tell you, well, you know, this is Arabic music, but of course the lyrics are in Hebrew, but what does it matter? I mean, we're working in Hebrew. And so there's this kind of weird space where it was kind of allowed, or it was kind of seen as something okay for only certain social groups. Of course, my parents and many others would frown upon this, seeing it that it's some kind of betrayal. So I was reading a lot of Jean-Luc Nancy, and I was inspired by the way that he talks about the difference between listening and seeing. So he says that when you listen, listening is making resonant, whilst seeing is about making evident. So you see something that's happening outside of you. But when you hear it, you understand it differently because it's entering your body and it's becoming a part of you. And so in this sense, listening can collapse the division between self and other, or singular and plural. So although music can become this place of transcending identities and affiliations and temporalities, it can also be used, and has been used, to strengthen feelings of collective identity that are based on exclusion of the other, on who doesn't figure into that collective identity. And it's precisely this ambiguity of music that I was interested in a place that can both hide politics, but also reveal it, and reveal kind of alternative histories. Okay. So if kind of this, just a brief recap of the themes. So for me, the film was about music and methods of recording, modernity, in modernity, politics of reenacting an archive, and the question of the Arab Jew as seen alongside the Palestinian one, and the ambiguous potential of music under national struggles. So while A Magical Substance for me was about how heterogeneity, kind of a heterogeneous society, can be a way of undermining a modern nation state, the next project looks at how flora, the diverse life of plants, gets classified under the taxonomy of modern science. So as I began earlier, I was saying that I was spending time looking at a lot of different archives in and around Jerusalem. And often when I would be leafing through these documents from the turn of the century till, let's say, or even earlier, till, let's say, the 1930s and 40s, there was a lot of pictures of plants, plants in different forms. So this is kind of a form of souvenir that was quite popular around the turn of the century, that was made either by missionaries, but also people who were just living there. This is from the American colony in Jerusalem. And they're souvenirs that are made out of plants that are then pressed. So they're dried and pressed flowers that are arranged into these bouquets. And then they would be kind of representing a specific site, usually a holy site. So here on the left, there's the flowers of the pools of Solomon. And on the right, it's a kind of more general collection of flowers. So a lot of these researchers, they weren't yet kind of divided into disciplines. There wasn't like an archaeologist would also be a botanist, and would also be a philologist and a translator and all of these things. And one of these figures was Gustav Daniel, who was another German ethnographer who wrote the first musicological study in Palestine, called Palästinische Divan, in 1901. And his work was firmly rooted in the belief that scientific study of the Bible land would unlock the Bible and help gain a deeper understanding of Christian theology. And his musical mission was to compare the Song of Songs in the Bible with the songs that Palestinians were singing in present day. So in other words, he was actually trying to understand what they were singing in the Second Temple, in the Jewish Second Temple 2,000 years ago. And the rural Palestinians, in this case, were a tool for finding proof for this biblical scripture. And in his archive, I also started coming across all of these kind of flower photos. It's today called the German Protestant Institute of Archaeology in the Holy Land. So in a way, he was the predecessor of Lachman, and he also kind of opened up this field of botany for me that, I kind of started to be more and more attracted to. So this is some more of the kind of images. This is just a vase of flowers on the left, and on the right, a study, a photographic study, a lantern slide. So I kind of started thinking that when I would finish the film on music, that I would do something on botany. And this is how I arrived to George Post. George Post was an American missionary who fought in the American Civil War and then was sent by the American mission to Syria, as it was called at the time. He first settled in Tripoli, where he was working as a medical doctor and a translator. He very quickly learned Arabic and started working on translations. Aside from being a doctor, he also participated in several expeditions for natural history and archaeology. And what he's most famous for is the Flora of Syria, Palestine and Sinai, which is a 2-volume book on listing the different plant life of the region, which is considered the most comprehensive flora of the region until today. He's also one of the founding fathers of AUB. He helped establish the medical department of the American University of Beirut. So today, this herbarium, it's still in use by some scientists. It's primarily a historical document of the landscape as it was. This is in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, because it documents when, for instance, if there would be a pressed flower, they would always write the date of this pressed flower, so we would know that a tulip, for instance, blooms, I'm making this up, but if a tulip blooms in April, for instance, on this hilltop. And of course, today, Beirut and Lebanon and Syria have changed radically. So a lot of these plants are either extinct or they bloom much earlier due to climate change. So it's a kind of, it's a document of the landscape, and it's a kind of bringing all the landscape into a cabinet and recording it with the morphology of the plants themselves. And yeah, interestingly, when Post kind of was collecting all of these specimens, he was working with his students at the Syrian Protestant College, which is now the AUB, the American University of Beirut. And he taught this course on botany where he would give his students an assignment to go and collect flowers from the furthest possible villages and towns that they could go to. So the further away you would collect from, the kind of higher grades that you would get. And all of this, all the collection of his students is what became kind of the herbarium that we still have today. But of course, he never mentions the name of his students. He also exchanged a lot of specimen with botanists in Turkey, for instance, or in other places, and he would often put his own name. So he was quite a kind of narcissistic figure. So as I was brainstorming kind of the form through which this kind of botanical research would materialize an artwork, I started looking a lot at still life painting and what flowers have come to symbolize in Western art history. So I came to learn about the revival of this genre in the 16th century Dutch painting, and that it had a lot to do with the emergence of botany as a discipline. So painters would be visiting botanical gardens that were becoming more and more prevalent in European centers. And they would learn from botanists when a certain flower is about to bloom, when it's worth studying and sketching. And then the bouquets that they would paint, like this one on the left, were a gathering of many separate studies, a miscellany that could actually never exist in nature. Norman Bryson, in his book on still life painting, he calls it a refusal of time and seasonality that breaks the bond between man and cycles of nature. And that is exactly the point. What is being explored is the power of technique, first of horticulture, botany, and then of painting, to outstrip the limitations of the natural world. And then between the bouquet and the landscape behind it, no connection can be discovered. The space is centripetal. The flowers fly to this vase from various lands, and they are distilled. All the greater spaces are concentrated in this one sovereign space of the vase. Yeah, so I kind of was collecting a lot of these different images of how kind of these flowers were being painted. Cézanne on the right, that's Cézanne from the beginning of the 19th century. The date there is wrong. Who kind of revived the genre of still life. And I also was looking at a lot of different images of vases. So these are some vases that I saw in an ethnographic museum in Buenos Aires. And that's what kind of inspired me to turn George Post's head into a vase. So this is kind of a detail of the installation. It's called the George Post Herbarium, but specifically the still life element is called a vase with a festoon of flowers and dictionary. It was first shown in the Liverpool Biennial last year and is currently in the Cologne Kunstverein. So what I tried to do here was kind of recreate a still life painting, but as in three-dimensional form. So I did a ceramic table set of George Post's head as a vase with a bouquet of flowers coming out that are flowers from his herbarium. And then there is books on the table that are his flora of Syria, Palestine, and Sinai, and also Bible dictionaries. Bible dictionaries are a kind of 19th century phenomena that came with science, kind of the merging of science and religion. So they would list all of the different names, places, objects, instruments, people mentioned in the Bible and give them a kind of scientific description that would, of course, limit then the interpretation of the scripture. And Post contributed to these Bible dictionary with all the flora entries. So yeah, anytime there's a mention of a flora, William E. Smith, who was made these Bible dictionaries, would ask George Post to write the entry. And in the background, we have a collage. Let me see. The collage is called A Biblical Landscape, and it's made from labels of cleaning products found in supermarkets and people's homes in Beirut, where I would cut out I only collected cleaning products which had smells of nature, so kind of this artificial smells of like cedar trees or lavender or acorns and so on. To create this kind of weak landscape or kind of an unimagined landscape which exists only as a digital rendition today. So you see that the bottles are there in the bottom left. So they're kind of anything from detergent to floor cleaning products and so on. And the idea was also to replicate this still life, the kind of the rules of the still life painting, where you would often have a landscape in the background, either through a window or hanging on the wall. And the landscape, of course, was always the place of heroicism. So it's where kind of the important historical events take place. And inside is the kind of domestic feminine space. So I was also kind of flipping this on its head and turning the landscape into this kind of cheap collage. On the left, there's a shelf with plywood sheets. On these plywood sheets are photographic prints of herbarium sheets from the George Post Herbarium. And of course, there's in the herbarium there's thousands and thousands of folders with the different specimen, and I had to make a selection of which one would enter this installation, and I decided to only take the Bible plants, which were the plants that interested George Post the most, that he wrote in the Bible dictionary. So I took out all of the flora from the Bible dictionary and I selected them out of the herbarium and photographed them. These photographs were then printed on plywood. And with laser cut, I laser cut the flowers out of the plywood. So you can see here that these flowers are only two-dimensional. They're wood cutouts. So it was a lot of play on on two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality. So kind of imagining that George Post was kind of collapsing the region of Syria, Palestine, and Sinai into a cabinet. So what would happen if I tried to kind of fold out this two-dimensional index of the landscape into three-dimensional form again? Let's see if I have any more. So that's a close-up of the storage. Okay, so we're going to go into discussion, and I can maybe go into more details. Just as a brief kind of note of conclusion, I just wanted to say that both projects have been, the starting point has been the archive or a specific archive, but rather than the archive being kind of the topic of focus, they have been just a starting point to bring forward a different representation of the present, and usually a kind of anti-hegemonic representation of history. And to kind of play around with it as material that's open for interpretation rather than a scientific record. And it's usually been using these kind of historical documents to either think about the present or future day scenarios. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jumana. Questions for Jumana? So I'll selfishly start. It's really beautiful how you're revisiting this production of knowledge, colonial production of knowledge, or fictional production of knowledge, and systems of classification. Are there resonances between George Post and Robert Lachman besides an ideological mind frame? Because one was a Jew who was a European Jew who felt the danger, and the other was a Protestant who came from a place of war, but then suddenly, had a lot of power or felt he could do something. Besides, but are there resonances in their gaze? Is it just the obsession with finding the Bible in Palestine?
I mean, this kind of biblical lens comes, of course, with the Orientalist view on the people. So, I mean, sometimes George Post, he would not only write the name of the places as they are today, but he would write their biblical name, as was the case for many botanists interested in this kind of Bible studies. In a way, Lachman was a bit less focused on the Bible, even though he inherited this from Gustav Daniel and kind of many others. He still had this idea that Palestine was frozen in time. But they were quite different. I mean, Lachman was a homosexual Jew escaping war with his German partner coming to Jerusalem, and he had real difficulty actually living in Jerusalem and finding people who could trust him and who believed in his work and wanted to fund it and so on. So he was always kind of at odds with the institution. So the Hebrew University never actually managed to help him establish a department. And the radio program also, I mean, the radio, they used to invite him, but he was never really a full-time employee there either, and he died very young in 1940, just a few years after he arrived. George Post is much different. I mean, he's a man with more power, I believe. He did establish a department. That's the medical department in AUB. And he lived much longer, and he stayed in Lebanon for quite a long time, for about 50 years or so overall. He arrived quite young, and I think he's died there. He's buried in Beirut. So yeah, quite different engagements. And of course, George Post is much earlier. He arrives in the 1860s, late 1860s, which is, 70 years before Lachman. And
do you have a next, are you studying some other?
Yeah, but I've moved into the present. I need a break from archives. So I'm actually, this work on the botany has kind of led me into kind of more contemporary questions on biotechnology and seed preservation. So I try to imagine what kind of equivalences of herbariums do we have today in science. And that's what got me thinking about seed banks, which are archives of all the different seeds, usually focused on food crops. So not only the crops that we actually eat, but all of the wild relatives of these crops, which are used in breeding to kind of create developed varieties for wheat, lentils, and so forth. And so I'm working on seed preservation and agricultural policies today.
I was wondering, how did the Israeli musicians that you interviewed, the young Moroccan singer or the employee of Kurdistan, of the
real estate.
Yes. How do they perceive themselves? Were they surprised that Lachman put them as Oriental music? Do they think they are religious music? Or do they think they are part of Arab music? Usually, how do, including the Samaritans who also you recorded, do they feel they belong to one tradition, or do they feel that you sort of, you looked at them this way? How do they perceive themselves today?
I don't think that Lachman even saw them as one tradition. I mean, he spoke about the umbrella of Oriental music, but he was really trying to show the distinction of each of these groups and their interrelations. So basically what Lachman wanted to say is you can't study the Oriental Jews without studying the Palestinians and all of their neighbors. So this was his message to the Hebrew University and also to the listeners of the broadcasts. So the Israelis today, I mean, most of them probably wouldn't say it's Arabic music, but they would say, yeah, I think they did identify with kind of the broader term of Oriental music. And there's a huge difference between someone like Neta El-Kayam, who is the younger woman in her kitchen, who's a very politicized figure. She's very outspoken with regards to the injustice done against the Moroccans and all of the kind of Mizrahis in Israel today. And also she speaks fluent Arabic, both Palestinian and Moroccan. So for her, singing this music is also a political project. It's not just entertainment. So she has a high awareness around these questions. But someone like Yaniv Ovadia, who was the Kurdish playing the saz in his appraiser's office that works with the Jerusalem municipality and other Zionist organizations that are expropriating Palestinian land, we didn't have much of a discussion. So, you know, I told him about the film, I told him about the research of Lachman and that I'm kind of recreating this radio program. He was mostly excited to be part of to be filmed and to be kind of recognized because he doesn't live from his music. As you can see, he works as an appraiser. So the musicians responded in many different ways, and I was expecting to find much more friction with the Israeli musicians, but I think they were both a bit confused. They weren't sure if I'm Palestinian or what my story. I mean, I spoke to them in Hebrew, and I wasn't sure if they really understood what my politics were, even though I tried to kind of share with them my project, and they either didn't mind or didn't fully understand what my position is. And they were excited that a Palestinian is recording their music, I think. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, because this man was the head of the police department in the West Bank. So he was, and as his son tells us, he never wore a uniform because he was clearly part of the intelligence. So he was a mista'arif, as we call them, a kind of pretending to be an Arab. And so, you know, for me, initially the concept was it would be powerful to see that this man has become part and parcel of the kind of the state. So if he would be wearing his police uniform and sing some Kurdish songs. And yeah, he doesn't have a police uniform, so that kind of ruined the shot a little bit. But he also wasn't so interested in singing, and he's the one who introduced me to Yaniv Ovadia, who's in the office. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I decided to keep that scene nevertheless because I think there's a lot of tension in the kitchen between me and him, and a lot of his stereotypes come out through the question. And the film was a lot about that also, about me going to meet these parts of Israeli society that I have no contact with and I don't necessarily look to be in contact with in a regular basis, but under kind of the premise of this film, I was able to have some kind of discussion with. So I wanted to keep that discomfort there in the beginning. And he's also the person through which we know what the film is about, because he asks me, are you making a film about the Kurds? And I say, no, I'm making a film about... And yeah, of course, because he thinks all Arab women should be in the house or something like this.
I have a question regarding the interaction between your sculpture and the movies. You showed us at the beginning the image where it was exhibited in London. Yes. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so this is a series of sculptures which I refer to as the muscle vases. So they're either enlarged body parts or muscles that I've sculpted as vases. So they're hollow plaster forms, and they're very much about resonance. So, and they refer to this idea of music as something that's existing both inside the body and outside of it at the same time. And it's about this kind of visceral and sensual kind of experience of music. And they were made before the film, actually. They were made around the same time, but a bit before. And it was at a kind of later stage of conceiving the installation that I decided it would be interesting to show them alongside the film, because they share this idea of resonance, and also kind of the theme of muscle memory that I was thinking about a lot when making the film. And then the idea was to create this kind of landscape that's something between kind of a museological display or a kind of desolate landscape or an unfinished architecture of some sort. So a lot of kind of thinking about some of the spaces where the music is performed in the film, like the last scene where we have an unfinished home where the wedding music is being performed, and so on. So it was it was for me like a way of translating some of the themes, maybe the more kind of metaphysical themes of the film, but through space and materiality.
I want to ask you about the continuation of the discussion on Lachman with the Rababa scene with the Bedouins. I thought, this is the third time I see your film, and every time I discover new things about it. And I was struck by the scene because I thought initially that what you have framed this film was a critique of Lachman. And I realized that the Rababa scene, of course, you must have decided what to include, what to exclude. It's a very desolate scene, and one conclusion one gets from it is the desolation not only of the land, but of the disappearance of the music that Lachman had recorded. So my question is, what sort of message, if there is one, that should be drawn from this Rababa scene and obviously the failure of the man to recapture, or maybe his refusal to capture the music that he was listening to, and his insistence that this is not a real Bedouin, something else that Lachman. What is the? Can you tell us more about this scene? Why did you decide to include it?
Yeah. Well, I think he's right that this was not a Bedouin. I mean, عم بقول إنه هذا فلاح مش بدوي. That this is a kind of peasant, not a Bedouin, who's performing, because he's playing too fast. A peasant does everything too fast. Bedouins take their time, and also that he's pronouncing things not in a Bedouin accent. So this was what he was objecting against, saying that Lachman took a peasant for a Bedouin. But for me, I mean, the scene shows that the Bedouin community in Palestine is maybe the part of Palestinian society that has suffered the most, and it's the Nakba of the Bedouins is continuing till this day with the demolishment of villages on a daily basis. And like all nomadic populations, but of course in Israel this was an extreme case that they tried to settle the Bedouins in villages. So with the settling, their culture was erased in a much more efficient way, you can say, than that of the fallahin, the rural communities and the urbanites. So I think it is more difficult to find talented rababa players today in the Naqb in comparison to wedding singers in the Galilee or other villages across Palestine. I mean, I went several times to the Naqb, each time somebody promising me that they're going to introduce me to a very good rababa player. And every time I would come, they would either tell me, oh, we've forgotten the rababa and it'll take too long to get it, or no, this man, I actually can't play very well, I introduce you to someone else. And it was very difficult to find musicians who could perform this. There was some Palestinians from the Galilee who played the rababa, but I wanted to find a Bedouin from the Naqab who could play. And as he was telling me, I mean, the rababa used to be a tool for kind of social gathering. There was no internet, there was no television, there was no technology. So we used to gather around and play the rababa as a way of spending time to one another. And today we just listen to it on YouTube. So when I asked him to kind of respond to Lachman's recording, he played me a song off of his phone. And he said, here, this is the best rababa player, but he's in Jordan. He's from our tribe, but he lives in Jordan now. I don't know if that answers your question.
Did it answer the question?
I mean, I don't know. I don't have a message, right? Like I was. This film is very much open to a lot of interpretations. I had quite specific questions working on it, but I wouldn't say that there's one message. Sure.
To come out with that actually it was a failure to preserve their own music, and the failure, of course, is contextualized by the condition of Bedouins in the Naqab. So there is a feeling not only of a desolation of the land, but a disintegration of the musical culture. And was this part of the message you wanted, or part of the perception that you were trying to bring about?
I think both failure and resilience. Yeah, and there's a failure to preserve certain traditions, and there are some, which are under, let's say, more threat of extinction. I don't know, I don't like that word, but yeah, of disappearing or changing, or. But most of the traditions have been quite resilient to all of the attempts of erasure. If anything, I think the film is, it's pointing that Lachman's project failed. I mean, not only to preserve the music, but his belief that through kind of cross-cultural study of music that you can get a better understanding of the different groups. He says this in the introduction when I'm reading his notes. I mean, he kind of has a belief in the reconciliatory powers of music, and I think this is naive on his behalf, and his program failed in that sense to bring that kind of greater understanding between the groups amongst themselves and also with the European communities. So maybe that's the failure that I was thinking about more.
Une dernière question.
Thank you. This is a follow-up also on Salim's question. We talked briefly about this. What I liked about that scene the most is the subtext of the scene, and not necessarily what you see on the screen, and the juxtaposition between the guy, his office, and surrounded by the maps of the future evacuation of that Bedouin tribe of Jahalin with the Rababa. So the connection between the two scenes is actually something that probably most viewers wouldn't grasp because they are not familiar with the details outside the frame of the screen. And I thought that was like a subtext that is missing as a matter of context for the understanding of that visual representation of the two sides of that. But my question is, actually I have a comment and a question. The comment is about your work with the vases and the turning post's head into a vase. In Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, there's this whole notion of the breaking of the vessel, that when humans were created, when Adam was created, there was a vessel that was supposed to contain the abundance of the grace of God. And that vase shattered and failed to do that. And what humans should do on earth is to collect the splinters of that primordial vase, cleanse them, and then match them back together in order to save God himself. But this has nothing to do with what I'm going to ask next, which is about Post himself. If I remember correctly, he was still the dean of the medical school at the AUB when in 1882 there was a student revolt, among others led by Jules Zaidan, who writes about that in his autobiography. And I was wondering about the context of both like you mentioned Eli Smith asking Post to illustrate sort of with his knowledge the biblical flower sections in the publications at the university. And in the Lachman case, I was wondering from a contextual point of view, what did other people, Palestinians in particular, who were working for the same radio station in Jerusalem in the 1930s, think about his project? Like Ibrahim Tuqan, for instance, the national poet of the Palestinians before Mahmoud Darwish, worked at the same period in that station. So, is there any archival material available to find out what did the contemporaries of Lachman, in his sort of immediate environment, think about their project, and what did the contemporaries of Post after Eli Smith died in 1857? What did they think about this particular project?
I mean, I'll start with Post, because when you mentioned the revolt, I mean, George Post, he kind of aligned himself with power always. And this is kind of partly why I thought he deserves to be turned into a vase. Because now I'm forgetting the names, but basically he was on the side of the head of the university. You can maybe help me out, who was kind of, rather than responding to the student revolts, this is the time when they changed from being teaching in Arabic to teaching in English. And Post supported that. I mean, he was supporting the kind of the crushing of the student revolt and the shift to English. And this is when he actually had to translate his Flora of Syria, Palestine and Sinai from Arabic to English so that he could teach it now. He wrote it first in Arabic and then translated it to English. I mean, I don't know enough about, I mean, I didn't spend a great deal of time reading kind of the AUB archive, so I don't know what they thought specifically of the herbarium project. I can't see any reason that people objected, because it was just pressed flowers kind of on the surface, and that's also what attracted me to it, that on the surface it looks so innocent, but of course even looking at flowers isn't innocent. So I don't think there was any objections about the herbarium, but there was objections around his personality, because apparently he wasn't a very sympathetic guy. As for Lachman, at the beginning of the film, there's this snippet of his voice when he's talking about the complaints in the Hebrew and the Arabic newspapers to the radio programs. So it's actually not clear to me, and the archivist couldn't tell me either, if the complaints were directed at his programs or the programs of the Palestine Broadcasting Station. But in general, there was a lot of complaints around the PBS, because it was a semi-colonial station. They had a section in Arabic run by Ibrahim and others later, and a section in Hebrew and a section in English. And they were really emphasizing this divide between the Hebrew speakers there and so forth. So there was all kinds of complaints at the radio, but specifically of Lachman's, I don't think that it was especially well received. You know, it wasn't a hit on the radio, but I didn't find any specific kind of critiques on the Oriental broadcasts.
I'm afraid we have to end it here. Je suis désolée. On doit arrêter, finir, conclure ici. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Jumana.
Thank you
It was
too.
a pleasure. Merci beaucoup.